In the winter of 1912, deep in the North Carolina Appalachians, a young woman vanished without a sound. But when her name, Margaret Hale, was whispered in the hollers, people lowered their voices, locked their doors, and pretended they hadn't heard a thing. Because what happened to her wasn't just tragic, it was something no one dared write down. This is the 1912 Appalachian horror the history books refuse to touch. Before we uncover this disturbing mystery, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more forgotten Appalachian stories. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing viewers from all over. Now, picture a rugged mountain community where secrets are carried by the wind, and every old cabin holds a story no one wants to repeat. Margaret Hale lived a quiet life, but the events leading up to her disappearance shook the entire valley and left behind questions that still haunt the region more than a century later. Tonight, we're digging into the truth behind the whispers, the rumors, and the terrifying clues that were almost lost to time. On the morning of October 17, 1912, a farmer named Thomas Whitley was walking his property line in the remote highlands of Watauga County, North Carolina. The autumn fog hung thick between the chestnut trees. Thomas had walked this same path every morning for 23 years. But on this particular morning, he would find something that would haunt him until his dying day. At approximately 7:15, his hound dog began barking near an old root cellar that had been abandoned for decades. The door, partially rotted and covered in moss, stood slightly ajar. Thomas approached slowly. The smell hit him first. He would later tell the county sheriff that it was unlike anything he had ever encountered. Sweet, metallic, wrong. Inside the cellar, in the dim light filtering through cracks in the wooden planks above, he saw her. A woman's body, or what remained of it, arranged in a position that defied natural death. Her hands had been placed carefully at her sides. Her hair, still remarkably preserved, had been braided with wildflowers that had long since withered to dust. And her eyes. Thomas Whitley would tell anyone who asked that her eyes were open, staring upward as if she had been watching something approach from above in her final moments. This was Margaret Hale. She had been missing for 7 months. The investigation that followed would become one of the most disturbing cases in North Carolina history. Not because of what was found, but because of what the evidence suggested had happened in the months leading up to her death. The story of Margaret Hale is not a simple tale of murder. It is something far more complex. Something that, even now, more than a century later, remains difficult to fully comprehend. To understand what happened to Margaret, we must go back. Back to where she came from. Back to the mountain community that shaped her. Back to the winter of 1911, when the first signs appeared that something terrible was beginning. The Appalachian highlands of North Carolina in the early 20th century were a world unto themselves. These were not the romanticized mountains of postcards and tourism brochures. These were working mountains, harsh mountains. Mountains where families lived in isolation, sometimes going weeks without seeing anyone outside their immediate household. Margaret Hale was born in 1887 to Samuel and Eunice Hale in a 2-room cabin 14 miles from the nearest town of Boone. She was the middle child of 7. Her father worked as a timber cutter. Her mother took in sewing and preserved food for the long winters. By all accounts preserved in county records and family letters, Margaret was an ordinary girl growing up in extraordinary isolation. The Hale family belonged to a community of approximately 40 families scattered across the ridges and hollows of that particular stretch of mountain They attended the same church, a small Baptist congregation that met in a building constructed from local stone. They traded goods, shared tools, and helped one another with harvests and barn raisings. It was a tight community by necessity. Survival in those mountains required cooperation. Margaret's childhood, as documented in her mother's diary, entries from which were preserved by the Historical Society, appeared unremarkable. She learned to read from her mother's Bible. She helped care for her younger siblings. She gathered herbs and wild greens from the forest. She attended school sporadically when weather permitted, walking 3 miles each way to a one-room schoolhouse. But there were details in those diary entries. Small things. Eunice Hale wrote in January of 1899 when Margaret was 12 years old. Margaret came home today with mud on her dress and would not say where she had been. Found her staring at the wall after supper. Asked her 3 times to help clear the table before she seemed to hear me. In March of 1901, Margaret sleeps poorly. I hear her moving about the loft at night. She talks in her sleep, but I cannot make out the words. In September of 1903, Margaret turned 16 today. She has become very quiet. Her father worries she is too withdrawn. She spends hours alone in the woods, says she is gathering roots but returns with empty hands. These entries, read now with the knowledge of what would come later, take on a different character. But at the time, they were simply the concerns of a mother watching her daughter grow into womanhood in a difficult and isolated place. In 1905, at the age of 18, Margaret met a young man named Robert Childress. He was from a family that lived over the ridge about 6 miles distant. He worked with his father as a blacksmith. By mountain standards, they were relatively prosperous. Robert was considered a good match. The courtship lasted 2 years. They were married in the spring of 1907 in the stone church, surrounded by both families. According to the marriage records, it was a typical mountain wedding. Simple, brief, followed by a meal at the Hale family cabin. Margaret moved to the Childress property, a modest house with a small forge where Robert worked. The first year of marriage appeared, from all outward evidence, to be ordinary. Margaret kept house. Robert worked the forge. They attended church. They visited family. But something was happening beneath the surface. Something that would not become apparent until much later. The winter of 1907 into 1908 was particularly harsh in the North Carolina mountains. Snow began falling in early November and did not fully melt until late March. The temperature dropped below zero for weeks at a time. Families retreated into their homes, venturing out only when absolutely necessary. It was during this winter that the first documented change in Margaret's behavior occurred. This comes from a letter written by Robert's mother, Helen Childress, to her sister who lived in Tennessee. The letter, dated February 12, 1908, was discovered in a family trunk in 1954 and later donated to the county archives. Helen Childress wrote, "I am troubled about Robert's wife. She came to our door last week in the middle of a snowstorm wearing only her house dress. No coat, no shoes. Her feet were blue with cold. When I brought her inside and asked what was wrong, she said she needed to go to the woods. She insisted she had heard someone calling her name. Robert came and fetched her home. He says she has been having spells. Says she wakes in the night and stands by the window for hours. I have told Robert he should take her to see Dr. Hartwell when the road's clear, but he is proud and says it is just the isolation of winter affecting her mind." The doctor mentioned Benjamin Hartwell, practiced in Boone. His records, most of which have been lost, show that Margaret did eventually visit him in April of 1908. His notes, partially preserved, indicate patient present with complaints of disrupted sleep, periods of distraction, reports of auditory phenomena. Recommend rest and iron tonic. Follow up in 6 weeks. Margaret did not follow up. According to census records and church attendance logs, she and Robert continued their lives in what appeared to be a normal fashion. Robert worked his forge. Margaret kept their household. They were seen at Sunday services. They attended community gatherings. But the private reality was becoming increasingly strained. This is evident from a series of letters between Robert and his brother James, who had moved to Virginia. These letters were found among James Childress's effects when he died in 1943. In June of 1908, Robert wrote, "Margaret is not herself. She goes through the motions of keeping house, but her mind seems elsewhere. Yesterday I found her in the root cellar at midday. When I asked what she was doing, she said she was listening. I asked, listening to what? She said the stones. The stones are talking. Brother, I confess I do not know what to make of this. I wonder if she is coming down with some illness of the mind." In August of 1908, Margaret hardly speaks now. She will sit for hours on the porch facing the woods. I have tried to draw her out, but she only looks at me as if I am interrupting something important. Last week I woke to find her standing outside in the yard in her nightdress. It was past midnight. When I brought her in, she became angry with me, said I should not have disturbed her, said she was waiting. I asked waiting for what? She would not answer. In October of 1908, I am at my wit's end. Margaret has stopped cooking. Stopped cleaning. She spends all her time either staring out windows or walking in the woods. When she returns, her dress is covered in burrs and leaves. Her hands are scratched from brambles. She will not tell me where she goes or what she does out there. Mother says I should send her back to her family, but what would I say to them? That their daughter has lost her reason? I keep hoping she will recover, that whatever has taken hold of her mind will release its grip. The winter of 1908 into 1909 brought more of the same. And then something changed. In March of 1909, Margaret Hale Childress stopped her strange behavior abruptly. According to Robert's letters, she simply returned to herself one morning. She got up, made breakfast, cleaned the house, and spoke to him normally for the first time in months. Robert wrote to his brother, I cannot explain it, but Margaret seems restored to her right mind. She is cheerful and talkative. She apologized for her behavior and said she was ill but is better now. I am greatly relieved. Perhaps it was some seasonal malady that is now past. For nearly 2 years this appeared to be true. Margaret resumed her regular life. Church records show consistent attendance. Neighbors who were interviewed decades later by local historians reported seeing Margaret at community events, at quilting circles, at barn raisings. She seemed by all accounts to be a normal young woman. In January of 1910, Margaret became pregnant. This comes from her mother's diary. Margaret told me today she is with child. Robert is pleased. I am grateful. Perhaps a baby will settle her. She has always been a restless spirit. The pregnancy progressed normally according to the few medical records that exist. Dr. Hartwell's notes from a visit in April 1910 indicate patient in good health. Pregnancy advancing without complication. Due approximately September. But Margaret never gave birth. In August of 1910, she miscarried. The baby was stillborn in the 7th month. This was not uncommon in that era, particularly in isolated mountain areas where medical care was limited. But the effect on Margaret was profound. Robert's letters from this period show a man struggling to help his wife through grief. In September 1910, Margaret will not leave her bed. She weeps constantly. I do not know how to comfort her. Mother says time will heal this wound, but I fear it goes deeper than ordinary grief. By October, Margaret had recovered enough to resume some household tasks. But something fundamental had changed. Multiple sources document this shift. Letters from family members, observations recorded by neighbors, even entries in the church deacon's log. Margaret began talking about the baby, not in the past tense, in the present tense. She referred to the child as if it were alive, as if she were caring for it. Helen Childress wrote to her sister in November 1910, Margaret has taken to carrying around a bundle of cloth wrapped like a baby. She rocks it. She sings to it. When I gently suggested there was no baby, she looked at me with such anger I stepped back. Robert does not know what to do. He has removed the bundle twice, and both times Margaret became hysterical until he returned it. This continued for months. Margaret would carry the bundle of cloth, treating it as if it were her living child. She would set a place for it at the table. She would speak to it. She would become distressed if anyone touched it or questioned its reality. In February of 1911, something new began. Margaret started talking about voices again. But these were different from the voices she had described during her first episode. These voices, she told Robert, were giving her instructions. A letter from Robert to his brother dated February 28, 1911. Margaret says the voices are telling her how to care for the baby. She says they speak to her from the woods. She says they are teaching her things. Old things. Secret things. I confess I am frightened. Not of Margaret, but for her. I fear her mind has become fully lost. In March of 1911, Robert made the decision to bring in outside help. He wrote to his brother, I have asked the pastor, Reverend Mullins, to come speak with Margaret. Perhaps a spiritual intervention will help where medical and familial approaches have failed. Reverend Mullins did visit. His account of that visit, recorded in his personal journal, which was later preserved by the church, provides one of the most detailed contemporary descriptions of Margaret's state of mind in early 1911. Reverend Thomas Mullins had served the Mountain Church community for 18 years when he visited Margaret Childress on March 15, 1911. He was an educated man by local standards, having attended seminary in Virginia. His journals, which he kept meticulously, provide invaluable insight into the religious and social life of the mountain communities during this period. His entry for March 15, 1911 is extensive. He wrote, Called upon the Childress home today at Robert's request. He is concerned about his wife's mental state. I found Margaret in the kitchen, neat in appearance, calm in demeanor. She greeted me warmly and offered coffee. We spoke of ordinary matters for some minutes. The weather, the spring planting, upcoming church events. She seemed entirely rational. Then I observed the bundle she kept near her at all times. A collection of cloth wrapped and tied to suggest the form of an infant. She touched it frequently as we talked, adjusted it, stroked it as one would stroke a baby's head. I gently broached the subject. I said, Margaret, Robert tells me you have been struggling since the loss of your child. She looked at me with clear eyes and said, I have not lost my child. My child is here. She indicated the bundle. I explained as kindly as I could manage that the bundle was cloth, that her baby had gone to be with the Lord, that holding on to this false representation was preventing her from properly grieving and healing. Her response disturbed me greatly. She smiled, not an irrational smile, not the smile of someone detached from reality, but a knowing smile, as if I were a child who did not understand something obvious. She said, "Reverend, I know what you see. I know what everyone sees. But there is seeing and there is seeing. The women in the woods have taught me the difference." I asked what women. She said, "The old women, the ones who were here before, the ones who know the old ways. They come to me at night, they show me things. They have shown me how to see properly, how to understand what is really there beneath what appears to be there." I confess I felt a chill at these words. I asked if she meant she was seeing spirits. She said no. She said spirits are simple. These are something else, something older, something that was here before people had words for such things. I attempted to explain that these visions were products of her grief-stricken mind, that she should pray for deliverance from these deceptions. She listened politely, but I could see she was merely tolerating my words. She did not believe them, or rather she believed her own experiences more strongly than she believed my theological explanations. I left the Childress home deeply troubled. Margaret is clearly suffering from delusions, yet she functions normally in most respects. She keeps house. She speaks rationally on all subjects except this one. It is as if her mind has split. One part remains tethered to reality while another has drifted into some fantasy realm. I have advised Robert to keep close watch over her. I have also suggested he consider having her evaluated by a doctor who specializes in diseases of the mind. There is a hospital in Morganton that treats such cases. But Robert is reluctant. He fears the stigma it would bring upon his family. He hopes the situation will resolve itself with time and prayer. I am not confident it will. Reverend Mullins's assessment proved prescient. The situation did not resolve. Instead, over the following months, it intensified in ways that would ultimately lead to tragedy. Spring and summer of 1911 passed with Margaret Childress becoming increasingly isolated. According to multiple accounts from neighbors and family members, she stopped attending church in April. She stopped participating in community gatherings. She rarely left her property. Robert continued his work at the forge, but neighbors noticed changes in him as well. He became withdrawn, less talkative. One neighbor, interviewed in 1958 for a local history project, recalled, "Robert Childress used to be a friendly man. Always had a wave and a word as you passed by. But that summer of 1911, he looked like a man carrying a great weight. He worked his forge, but there was no life in him." In June of 1911, Margaret's mother, Eunice Hale, visited her daughter. Her diary entry from June 10th provides a disturbing glimpse into Margaret's condition. "Walked to Margaret's house today. Found her in the yard, that bundle of rags in her arms. She was talking to it as if it could hear and understand, singing lullabies. When she saw me, she smiled and invited me inside. The house was clean but strange. Margaret has hung bundles of dried plants from the ceiling beams. The smell is strong. She says the plants are for protection." I asked protection from what? She said from interference, from those who do not understand. We sat, and I tried to speak sense to her. I reminded her that she has a husband who loves her, a family that cares for her, a place in this community. I begged her to put aside the cloth bundle and accept that the Lord took her baby for his own purposes. She listened with patience, but I could see I was not reaching her. When I finished, she took my hand and said, "Mother, I know you mean well, but you do not understand what has been revealed to me. The baby is not gone. The baby is transformed. The baby is in between. And I am learning to exist in between as well. The women are teaching me." I asked again about these women. She said they come at night, sometimes in dreams, sometimes in waking. They are teaching her the old knowledge, the knowledge that existed before the church, before the settlements, before any of it. I confess I became frightened then. This talk sounds like witchcraft, like the devil's whisper. I told her so. She simply smiled and said the devil is a Christian invention. These things are older than Christianity, older than any religion. I left troubled. I spoke with Robert before departing. He is at the end of his rope. He says Margaret spends entire nights awake, sometimes outside, sometimes wandering the house. He says she has begun marking things, symbols on the walls and charcoal, arrangements of stones in the yard. When he asked her why, she says she is making preparations. I fear for my daughter's soul, and I fear for what may come if this continues. What came was accelerating strangeness. In July, neighbors reported seeing lights moving through the woods near the Childress property late at night. Not lantern light. Something else. Something that moved in ways that did not suggest a person carrying a lamp. In August, Margaret was seen by several people standing at the edge of the woods behind her house for hours at a time, motionless, staring into the trees. When approached and asked if she was well, she would turn and walk back to the house without speaking. September brought the first incident of violence. This is documented in a letter from Robert to his brother. "I must tell you something terrible. 3 nights ago I woke to find Margaret gone from bed. I searched the house and found her in the root cellar. She had killed one of our chickens. She had opened it and arranged its organs in patterns on the floor. The blood was everywhere. When I demanded to know what she was doing, she said she was reading signs. She said the women had taught her how to read what is written in blood and bone. She said the organs showed her things, showed her what was coming. I was so angry and frightened I shouted at her. I grabbed her arm to pull her from that place. She turned on me with a rage I have never seen in her. She struck me across the face. She said I had no right to interrupt her work. I confess I did not know what to do. I left the cellar and locked it from outside. In the morning, I opened it to find Margaret asleep on the floor, covered in dried blood. I cleaned her and put her to bed. When she woke, she seemed to have no memory of the incident. Brother, I believe my wife has become dangerous. Not just to herself, but potentially to others. Yet I do not know where to turn. If I have her committed to the asylum, she will likely spend the rest of her life there. Those places are terrible. But I cannot continue like this. I am afraid to sleep in my own house. This was written September 24th, 1911. Less than 3 weeks later, everything changed forever. On the night of October 12th, 1911, Margaret Hale Childress disappeared. The circumstances of her disappearance have been documented through multiple sources. Robert's testimony to the sheriff, statements from neighbors, and physical evidence found at the scene. Robert's account, given to Sheriff William Hampton on October 14th, 1911, is preserved in the county records. On the evening of October 12th, Margaret and I ate supper together. She seemed calm, normal even. We spoke little. After the meal, I went out to the forge to finish some work I had promised to complete. Margaret said she was tired and would go to bed early. I worked until perhaps 9 o'clock. When I returned to the house, all the lamps were extinguished. This was not unusual. I assumed Margaret had indeed gone to sleep. I was quiet entering so as not to wake her. But when I reached our bedroom, she was not there. I checked the other room, the kitchen. She was nowhere in the house. I lit a lamp and searched outside. I called her name. No response. I noticed the door to the root cellar stood open. I went there hoping to find her, though dreading what I might find given her previous behavior in that place. The cellar was empty. I spent the next hours searching the property in the near woods, calling for her. By midnight, I was deeply worried. By dawn, I was certain something terrible had happened. I went to my parents' house, and my father helped me organize a search. We gathered men from several neighboring families. We spent all of October 13th combing the woods and hollows around our property. We found no trace of her. That is when I reported her missing to you, Sheriff. Sheriff Hampton's report, filed October 14th, includes additional details. I proceeded to the Childress property with Deputy Morrison to investigate the disappearance of Margaret Childress. We examined the house and grounds. Several concerning elements were discovered. In the house, we found strange markings on the walls of the bedroom, symbols drawn in what appeared to be charcoal. Robert Childress stated he had not seen these before, suggesting Margaret drew them on the night of her disappearance. In the yard behind the house, we found an arrangement of stones in a circular pattern. In the center of the circle, burned remnants of cloth and plant material. Robert identified the cloth as coming from the bundle Margaret had been carrying for months, the one she treated as if it were her infant child. Most disturbing, we found tracks leading from this burned circle into the woods. Bare footprints. A woman's feet based on size. The tracks led approximately 200 yards into the forest before disappearing at a rocky outcrop. We organized an expanded search party. 27 men participated. We searched in a radius of 5 miles from the Childress property. We found no further trace of Margaret Childress. I have interviewed neighbors and family members. No one saw or heard anything unusual on the night of October 12th. No one has any information about where Margaret might have gone or why. The case remains open as a missing person investigation. The search continued for weeks. Men from across the county volunteered time to comb the mountains. They checked caves, ravines, any place a person might have fallen or taken shelter. They found nothing. Margaret's family was devastated. Her mother's diary entries from this period are heartbreaking. October 15th. Margaret is missing. My daughter is gone. I cannot sleep. I cannot eat. Where is she? Lord, where is my child? October 20th. Still no sign. The men search every day. Robert is beside himself. He blames himself, though I have told him this is not his fault. Something took hold of Margaret's mind. Something we could not fight. October 28th. A month of searching has yielded nothing. Some are saying she ran off. Others say she met with foul play. A few whispered darker things, that she was taken by something from the woods. Old mountain superstitions that I never gave credit to before. But now I wonder what my daughter was truly experiencing all those months. November passed with no developments. December brought early snow. That made searching nearly impossible. The official search was suspended. Margaret Childress was simply gone. Robert fell into deep depression. His mother wrote to her sister, "Robert barely speaks. He keeps his forge but takes no pleasure in work. He stays in that house alone. I have begged him to come stay with us, but he refuses. He says he must remain in case Margaret returns. Winter sealed the mountains in snow and ice. The community moved on. Margaret Childress became a sad story, a troubled woman who'd wandered into the wilderness and died. Eventually, most assumed someone would find her remains, but for now, she was simply missing. The winter of 1911 into 1912 passed. Spring came. The snows melted. And Margaret Hale Childress remained missing until October 17, 1912, when Thomas Whitley's hound led him to that root cellar and the horror it contained. The root cellar where Margaret's body was found belonged to an abandoned homestead approximately 7 miles from the Childress property. The homestead had been built in the 1840s by a family named Turner. They had lived there for 3 generations before the last Turner. An elderly woman named Constance died in 1901. The property had sat empty for 11 years. The cellar itself was built into the hillside, a common construction technique in the mountains. Stone walls, dirt floor, a wooden door that had rotted over years of neglect. The space was approximately 8 feet by 10 feet, with a ceiling height of about 6 feet at the center, sloping lower at the edges where it met the hillside. When Sheriff Hampton and his deputy arrived at the scene on the morning of October 17, 1912, they found Thomas Whitley sitting on the ground outside the cellar, visibly shaken. The sheriff's report describes what they found inside. The body was lying on the dirt floor in the center of the cellar. Female. Identity subsequently confirmed as Margaret Childress, who has been missing for 12 months. The body was in a remarkable state of preservation given the time elapsed since disappearance. Clothing consisted of a simple dress, much decayed, no shoes. Hair long and had been arranged in braids, though much of the material used to bind the braids had decomposed. Wildflowers, long dead, had been woven into the hair. The body was positioned on its back, arms at sides, legs straight. The position was too orderly to suggest natural death or accident. Someone had arranged the body deliberately. Most disturbing, evidence of extensive trauma. Multiple lacerations to the abdomen. Incisions that appeared deliberate rather than accidental. The body cavity had been opened. Internal examination will be required to determine full extent of damage. Around the body, arranged in circular patterns, stones, dried plant materials, small bones, animal, not human, pieces of metal including nails and wire shaped into symbols. The scene suggests ritualistic activity. Deputy Morrison noted similarities to stories he had heard from old mountain families about ancient practices. He refused to elaborate, stating only that his grandmother had warned him about such things as a child. Dr. Benjamin Hartwell was summoned from Boone to examine the body. His medical report, filed October 19, 1912, provides clinical detail. Female body, age approximately 25 years. Estimated time of death, 8 to 12 months prior to discovery based on decomposition, though preservation is unusual for this time period. Cool, dry conditions of the cellar likely contributed to slower decay. External examination reveals multiple incised wounds to the torso. These are clean cuts, suggesting a sharp blade. Pattern of cuts forms deliberate design across abdomen and lower chest. Cuts penetrate deeply, exposing internal structures. Internal examination reveals removal of several organs. Heart absent from chest cavity. Liver partially removed. Small portions of intestines missing. Cannot determine if this occurred before or immediately after death, though amount of blood saturation in surrounding tissue suggests heart was still beating when incisions began. indicating these injuries were the cause of death. Based on wound patterns, victim was likely restrained during the process. No defensive wounds on hands or arms. This suggests either victim was unconscious, was unable to resist due to physical restraint, or possibly submitted willingly, though the last seems least likely. Cause of death: exsanguination due to traumatic evisceration. Manner of death: homicide. The medical examiner's verdict was clear. Margaret Childress had been murdered, and the method of her murder suggested something beyond a simple crime of passion or robbery gone wrong. This had been deliberate, methodical, planned. Sheriff Hampton immediately opened a murder investigation. But he faced an immediate problem. There were no obvious suspects and virtually no evidence pointing to anyone in particular. Robert Childress was questioned extensively. He had an alibi for the time period when Margaret likely died. Multiple witnesses confirmed he had been at his forge during the days following Margaret's disappearance. His parents confirmed he had been staying with them during much of that time. He was distraught at the news of Margaret's death. The sheriff's notes indicate, Robert Childress broke down completely upon being told his wife was found murdered. His grief appears genuine. No evidence connects him to the crime. The investigation expanded to interview everyone who had known Margaret. Family members, neighbors, church members. No one had seen anything suspicious. No one had noticed any strangers in the area around the time of Margaret's disappearance. But several people, when questioned, mentioned Margaret's strange behavior in the months before she vanished. They repeated her claims about women teaching her things, about old knowledge, about seeing what others could not see. And several older residents, when pressed, spoke reluctantly about old stories. Stories passed down through generations. Stories about things that happened in the mountains long before churches and sheriffs. Stories about practices that were forbidden to speak of openly. One woman, Mary Stanton, age 72, told the sheriff something that he included in his report despite his obvious skepticism. There have always been women in these mountains who knew things, who practiced things, old ways from before. My grandmother told me about them, said they gathered in secret places, said they worked with forces that good Christian folk should leave alone. She warned me to stay away from certain hollows, certain old homesteads. The Turner place where you found that poor girl, my grandmother told me to never go there. Said it was a place where the old ones used to gather. Said bad things happened there long ago. I thought it was just superstition, old wives' tales. But now I wonder. The sheriff investigated the Turner property more thoroughly. He found other cellars and outbuildings on the abandoned homestead. In one collapsed structure, they found more strange arrangements of stones and bones, old fire pits, marks carved into wooden beams, though so weathered they were barely visible. But none of this pointed to a specific killer. None of it explained who had murdered Margaret Childress or why. The investigation stalled. Weeks passed, then months. No new evidence emerged. No witnesses came forward. The case remained open but effectively frozen. Until January of 1913, when something happened that changed everything. On January 8, 1913, a woman named Ruth Palmer vanished from her home in the same mountain region where Margaret Childress had lived and died. Ruth was 21 years old, married for 6 months to a man named David Palmer. Like Margaret, Ruth had been exhibiting strange behavior in the weeks before her disappearance. David Palmer's statement to Sheriff Hampton dated January 10, 1913. Ruth had not been herself since autumn. She complained of dreams, terrible dreams that left her shaken. She said dead things were calling to her. I told her it was just nightmares, but she insisted they were more than that. In December, she began walking at night. I would wake to find her gone. She would be outside in the cold, standing in the yard, looking toward the woods. When I brought her in, she would say she heard singing, women singing old songs in a language she did not know but somehow understood. On the night of January 7th, I woke around midnight and Ruth was gone again. I went outside to fetch her, but she was not in the yard. I called her name. I searched with a lamp. I could not find her. In the morning, I organized a search. We have been looking for 2 days. We have found nothing. Sheriff, I am terrified. I heard what happened to Margaret Childress. Ruth was talking the same way Margaret talked before she disappeared. About women in the woods. About old knowledge, about things I cannot understand. Please, you must find her. Before whatever happened to Margaret happens to Ruth. Sheriff Hampton immediately mobilized a large search party. Every able-bodied man in the region was called upon. They combed the mountains systematically. This time, they knew what to look for. They checked every abandoned homestead, every root cellar, every cave and hollow. On January 15th, they found Ruth Palmer. She was alive, and the circumstances of her discovery answered some questions while raising far more troubling ones. She was found in a cave approximately 9 miles from her home. She was sitting cross-legged in the center of the cave floor. She was dirty but unharmed. She was conscious but unresponsive. When the men tried to speak to her, she looked through them as if they were not there. They carried her out of the cave. They brought her home. Dr. Hartwell examined her and found no physical injuries, but mentally Ruth Palmer had gone somewhere else.